When you create a macro in Microsoft Excel, that macro can be seen and run by any procedure in any open workbook. If you want to control that macro's visibility, or scope, you can do so by using the public and private keywords. Excel assumes that any macro you create in a general code module should be available to be run from every open workbook. I'll show you what that looks like in my workbook here. I'm in Module 1, and this is a general code module. These are the worksheet and this workbook code modules here. Down in the modules section, you will find what are called general code modules. If you want a macro to be available for running in any open workbook, you can either type the public keyword in front of your macro's opening substatement, like this, or you can leave it out. Now with the public keyword set, and actually I'll delete it just to show you the default case. In other words, if you put nothing in front of the subdeclaration. And now I'll switch back to the main workbook, and I will create a new workbook by pressing Control-N. And if I go into the macros dialog box, you'll see that even though I'm in another workbook, I do have the display commission macro in the scope.xlsm workbook displayed as a macro that I can run. So what this macro does is calculate a commission based on the amount of a sale. So if I cancel here, type in a number, say 20,000, select the cell, and then run the macro, Excel displays a message box indicating that the commission is $1,000. On the other hand, if you want to limit your macro scope, you can put the private keyword in front of the sub keyword. When you do, that macro is only visible within the workbook where it's stored. So I will switch back to the scope workbook and then Alt F11 to go back into my code module. And in front of the sub display commission line, I will type private. So now if I press Alt F11 to go back into the main workbook, and then I'll switch windows over to book 1, the new workbook I created. If I open the macros dialog box, you'll notice that the macro is no longer visible. By using the private keyword, I have limited that macro scope. So if I get rid of this workbook, and I don't need to save my changes, and Alt F11 to go back to the code, you can see that the private keyword did its job. I think it's a very good idea to make your subroutines private unless you have a very good reason not to. As an example of what can go wrong, suppose you have a macro that deletes the worksheet named Sheet 1, which is an action you can't undo by pressing Ctrl-Z or clicking the undo button. If you build a macro and expect that Sheet 1 can be deleted at any time, you won't have any unpleasant surprises. However, if a colleague opens another workbook with important data on Sheet 1 and permanently removes it from their workbook by accident, you might have to spend hours redoing your work. Some Excel experts argue that you should make every macro private, so that it can only be run within the workbook where it's stored. I don't go quite that far. Some macros are innocuous and won't cause any damage if all they do is read a cell value and display a message box. That said, if your macro alters or deletes data, you should strongly consider putting the private keyword in front of the sub keyword to ensure that macro doesn't affect another workbook by accident.